The wind arrived before the temperature dropped. That is how the old-timers in the northern Dakota Territory always describe the worst winters. Not by how cold the air became, but by how the wind moved first low and deliberate across the open grassland, pressing itself against every wall, every gap, every seam of every structure, standing between the plains and the horizon. It came without negotiation. It came without the courtesy of a gradual descent. 1 hour the air was still, the sky holding its breath above a landscape so flat that a man standing on a fence post could see the curve of the earth. And the next hour the wind was there, had always been there, would always be there. A presence so total that the silence before it felt like a lie the prairie had told just to see who would believe it. It was January of 1886. The settlement of Tillman Creek sat low against the frozen earth, roughly 60 miles northwest of Bismarck, a loose collection of homestead claims, straddling a creek bed that had not carried moving water since late October. 14 families had retreated deep into their cabins by nightfall. Fires burned in every hearth. Wood stacked beside every door was disappearing cord by cord as the hours passed. And the thermometer nailed to the post office wall had read 22 degrees below zero at 4 in the afternoon and had not moved since. From a distance, any traveler crossing a ridge above the settlement would see the same sight repeated in every direction. Thick columns of gray-white smoke climbing from every rooftop, bending sharply east under the force of the wind. The visible proof that inside each of those cabins, someone was feeding a fire as fast as human hands could manage it. Every rooftop, that is, except one. On the southwest edge of the settlement, set slightly apart from the others by a shallow rise of earth, and a windbreak of planted cottonwoods that had not yet grown tall enough to do much good. One cabin showed almost no smoke at all. A thin thread, barely visible against the dark sky, curled upward from its stovepipe and vanished before it reached the height of the ridgepole. The fire inside was burning, but barely a whisper where every other cabin was shouting. And yet the light from its windows was steady and warm. Not the frantic orange of a fire being pushed to its absolute limit. Not the desperate flicker of flames chasing too much draft. But the calm amber glow of a room that did not need to be fought for. A room that was holding its warmth the way a stone holds the heat of a summer afternoon, long after the sun has dropped below the horizon. What that cabin held, what its owner had built into its very walls during the weeks before winter arrived, was not magic. It was not luck. It was the result of one woman's careful observation, her refusal to accept that suffering through winter was the only available option, and a construction method so simple and so deeply counterintuitive that her neighbors had called her foolish for attempting it. By morning, they would call her something else entirely. To understand what Clara Holbrook built, you first have to understand what she was building against. Go back 8 months to the early spring of 1885, when Clara arrived at her claim on the Dakota Plains for the first time. She was 34 years old, a widow from eastern Wisconsin, whose husband, Thomas Holbrook, had died of a fever 2 winters prior, leaving her with a 160-acre homestead claim filed under the Homestead Act, a small amount of savings that would not last through a second year if she was not careful, and a working knowledge of wood and joinery she had learned from her father. Her father had been a cooper in Easton for 30 years. He built barrels. That fact would matter more than anyone, including Clara herself, might have guessed at the time, because a cooper does not simply shape wood. A cooper understands wood the way a sailor understands water, not as a static material, but as a living thing that moves, that breathes, that swells when wet and shrinks when dry, that splits along its grain and resists across it, that holds liquid on one side, while the other side stays bone dry if the staves are cut right and the hoops are set true. Clara had grown up with her hands on white oak and hickory, feeling for the direction of the grain, learning to read the surface of a board the way other children learn to read letters on a page. She knew when wood was seasoned and when it was green. She knew how moisture traveled through a plank and where it would collect. She knew that wood was never truly still, even when it looked solid and permanent and fixed. Wood was always doing something. You just had to pay attention to find out what. She brought that knowledge west with her, along with very little else. A wagon, A horse named Dutch, who was 12 years old and patient in the way that only a horse who has survived a Wisconsin winter can be patient. A trunk of tools that had belonged to her father, planes and draw knives, and a brace and bit that still turned true. $300 in a leather wallet sewn into the lining of her coat, because banks in the Dakota Territory were not yet the kind of institutions a widow traveling alone could afford to trust. And one more thing, invisible but as real as any of the tools in her father's trunk, a complete and settled absence of illusions about what lay ahead. Clara Holbrook was not a romantic about the frontier. She was not running from grief. She was not chasing the poetic emptiness of the American West that newspaper writers in Chicago and New York like to describe from the comfortable distance of their editorial offices. She had a legal claim to a piece of land. She had 5 years under federal law to prove up that claim by establishing residence and making improvements, or she would lose it. She had enough money to survive if she was precise, and not enough to survive if she was careless. That was the arithmetic. She was going to do the arithmetic and nothing else. The Dakota Territory in the mid-1880s was not a gentle place to begin again. The landscape itself seemed designed to test intention. Flat, vast, and unforgiving in a way that is difficult to appreciate without standing in the middle of it. A person could walk for an hour in any direction and arrive at a place that looked exactly like the place they had left, the same grass, the same sky, the same wind pushing at their back, as though the prairie itself was trying to nudge them somewhere else, anywhere else. The nearest tree line capable of providing building-grade timber was more than 12 miles to the northeast along the river breaks, where cottonwood and elm grew thick in the shelter of the bluffs. Everything else, the open plain stretching in every direction, offered grass, sky, and wind. Plenty of wind. The kind of wind that did not merely blow but inhabited a place, that wrapped itself around structures and worked at them the way water works at stone, patient, relentless, never in a hurry, because it knew it had all winter, and the next winter, and the winter after that. The settlers who arrived before Clara had already worked out a rough survival calculus for this landscape. A standard single-room log cabin, if you could source the logs and haul them the 12 miles from the river breaks, without losing a wheel in the autumn mud, measured roughly 16 by 20 feet. It required somewhere between 8 and 12 full cords of firewood to survive the winter months from November through March, depending on the severity of the season and how many cracks the wind found in the chinking before Christmas. One cord of firewood measures 4 feet high by 4 feet wide by 8 feet long, roughly 128 cubic feet, and weighs between 2,000 and 3,000 pounds, when dry depending on the species. Cottonwood runs lighter, elm runs heavier. Both burned faster than the hardwoods Clara had known in Wisconsin, the oak and maple and hickory that her father had fed into his workshop stove in measured, deliberate pieces that would glow for hours. Dakota wood burned hot and brief, like a conversation with someone who has somewhere else to be. Hauling that volume of wood across open plains with a single horse and wagon in autumn mud that could swallow a wheel up to the axle was not a minor logistical challenge. It was the central challenge of frontier life in that region, the task around which every other task orbited from September through November. Local accounts from the period described families spending the entire month of October doing almost nothing else but moving and stacking firewood. Every trip a 12-mile round journey to the river breaks, and back the wagon groaning under green timber that would need weeks to season before it could burn properly, the horse straining against a trail that was not really a trail at all, but a series of ruts that previous wagons had carved into the earth, and that rain and snow and frost had been trying to erase ever since. And even after all that work, after all those trips, after every man and woman and child old enough to lift a split log had spent a month doing nothing but dragging wood across the plain, they would still run short. Oral histories collected from descendants of Tillman Creek settlers in the early 20th century describe winters where families burned furniture by February, stripped interior wall boards by March, and in the worst seasons burned the roof boards themselves. Lying awake listening to the wind howl through the gaps where the shingles had been, while they fed the last of their shelter into the fire that was supposed to make their shelter unnecessary. A family named Marsh, who had settled 2 claims north of where Clara would build, reportedly spent the final 3 weeks of March 1884 sleeping in a cabin with no interior walls and half a roof huddled around a stove. They fed with anything they could pry loose from the structure itself. They survived. Their cabin did not. They rebuilt it that spring, and by the following October they were hauling wood again, feeding the same cycle that had nearly killed them, because nobody had shown them a different cycle existed. The standard frontier cabin of the 1880s Dakota plains was not merely uncomfortable in winter. It was, by any reasonable measure, a structural failure at the single most important task it was supposed to perform. The walls were the problem. Settlers understood this in a vague, frustrated way. The cold came through the walls. The wind found every crack. But few thought systematically about what was actually happening at the level of materials and physics, because the language for that kind of thinking had not yet arrived in a place where survival left very little room for abstraction. Heat moves. It always moves from where there is more of it to where there is less. This is not a theory or an opinion. It is a fact as fixed as gravity, as certain as the sun crossing the sky from east to west. A log wall, even a well-chinked one with every gap filled and every crack sealed, has a limited capacity to slow that movement. Wood conducts heat. It does so slowly compared to metal, slowly compared to stone, but it conducts it nonetheless, and an 8-inch log wall standing between a heated room and a Dakota winter night is not a barrier. It is a delay. A temporary argument against physics that physics will always win. Once the fire in the hearth falls below a certain output, the wall stops resisting and starts conducting. It becomes a highway for heat, pulling warmth from the interior and releasing it to the outside air as fast as the fire can produce it. The fire burns hotter to compensate. The wood disappears faster. The family stacks more logs, and by 4 in the morning, despite all of it, despite every cord burned and every hour spent hauling, and every aching back and frozen hand that paid for that wood, the temperature inside the cabin has often dropped to within 15 or 20 degrees of the air outside. A person can do everything right in a cabin like that. Seal every crack, burn every log, stay awake all night feeding the fire. And the cabin will still betray them before dawn, because the cabin was never designed to hold heat. It was designed to hold a roof over their heads. Those are not the same thing. And the difference between them is measured in cords of wood and hours of sleep, and sometimes in the worst winters in lives. This is the trap that every family in Tillman Creek lived inside. More fire, more wood, more trips to the river, breaks more exhaustion. And still the cold came through. Not because the settlers were lazy or ignorant or careless, but because the tools they had and the time they were given and the pressures they were under had produced a building type that solved the wrong problem beautifully and the right problem not at all. The fireplaces and stoves themselves compounded the failure in ways that would have seemed almost deliberately wasteful if anyone had been in a position to step back and measure them. Most frontier hearths of this period were open-face designs, a firebox set into one wall and open to the room with a stone or clay-lined flue rising above. These were capable of producing impressive amounts of radiant heat in the immediate vicinity of the fire. A family sitting within 6 feet of an open hearth on a January night could feel genuinely warm, warm enough to believe the cabin was doing its job. But that warmth was a circle, not a condition. Step 10 feet from the fire and the temperature dropped. Step to the far wall and breath came out in clouds. Open fireplaces are notoriously inefficient thermal devices. Studies of comparable historic hearth designs suggest that between 70 and 85% of the heat energy produced by an open fire exits through the chimney flue, along with the combustion gases carried upward and outward by the same draft that keeps the fire burning in the first place. For every log a settler burned, only 15 to 30% of its stored energy ever reached the room. The rest went up and out into the Dakota sky, a river of warmth pouring through the chimney, into air that was already so cold It could kill an exposed person in under an hour. At the consumption rates common in Tillman Creek during the winter of 1884 to 1885, the winter before Clara's first full season on the claim, local accounts suggest that the average family burned between 9 and 11 cords of wood to survive from November through March. That represented somewhere between 18,000 and 33,000 pounds of firewood hauled by hand and horse across 12 miles of rutted plains, trail stacked, split and fed into a firebox that returned less than a third of its energy to the space it was supposed to heat. Everyone in the settlement knew the system was broken. The older settlers spoke about it with the particular resignation of people who had decided that a problem was simply part of the landscape, as unavoidable as the wind itself, as permanent as the cold. They burned more wood. They slept closer to the fire. They wore their coats indoors, and they told their children that this was what winter meant. The word they used most often when they talked about the cold was endure, not solve, not fix. Endure, as though winter were a punishment that had to be accepted rather than a problem that could be engineered against. What none of them had asked, what Clara began asking that first autumn, with the persistence of someone who had learned from her father that every problem with wood had an answer. If you understood, the wood was whether the wall itself could be made to hold heat rather than surrender it. Clara Holbrook did not arrive at her idea by accident. She arrived at it by paying attention to the wrong things in exactly the right way. Her neighbors remembered her that first summer as a woman who asked too many questions, and more troubling than the quantity was the direction. She did not ask about crops or water rights or the price of wheat at the Bismarck railhead, the questions that occupied most of the settlement's daily conversation. She asked about the cabins. She walked the perimeter of other people's homes on cold mornings, pressing her palm flat against exterior log faces, feeling where the surface was warmer and where it was colder. She watched where frost formed first on exterior walls and where it melted last. She noted which corners stayed coldest overnight and traced the air movement inside her own cabin with a candle flame held near the baseboards, watching where the flame bent toward the drafts rising from floor gaps, mapping the invisible rivers of cold air that ran along the floor of every cabin in Tillman Creek, like underground streams that no one had bothered to chart, because everyone had agreed they were simply there. She spent an afternoon in late August sitting on the ground outside the marsh cabin, the one that had lost half its roof the previous March, studying the way the replacement logs had been set. The Marsh family watched her from inside without comment. They were accustomed by then to the widow from Wisconsin, who walked around touching walls and staring at corners. They did not understand what she was looking for, but they had the frontier courtesy not to ask twice after she had already answered once with something vague about studying construction. What she was studying was failure. Not the failure of the Marsh family who had done everything their experience and their resources allowed them to do. The failure of the building itself. She was reading the cabin the way her father had taught her to read a barrel, looking for the place where the design stopped working. The stave that leaked, the hoop that slipped, the joint where moisture crept in and began its slow, destructive work. Her father used to hold a finished barrel up to the light of his workshop window and turn it slowly, looking for the faint gleam that meant light was passing through a seam that should have been tight. Most people look at the whole barrel, he told her once when she was 12. They see a barrel. I look at the spaces between the staves. That is where the barrel lives or dies. Clara was looking at the spaces between the staves of every cabin in Tillman Creek, and what she saw was heat dying in those spaces, pouring outward through 8 inches of wood that could not hold it, whistling through, chinking that cracked as it dried, rising through roof joints that shrank apart during the first hard freeze and never closed again until spring. Her nearest neighbor, Henry Dahl, a farmer from Minnesota whose family had been settled in the upper Midwest for 2 generations later, recalled in a letter preserved in a family collection that he found Clara one October morning, standing inside her half-finished cabin wall cavity, pressing her ear against the log face as though listening to it. The image was strange enough that Henry remembered it precisely the way a person remembers a small thing that does not make sense at the time, but takes on meaning later. She had her eyes closed. Her palm was flat against the wood. Her head was tilted at the angle of someone straining to hear a sound just below the threshold of hearing. When he asked what she was doing, she told him she was trying to understand what the wall did with heat overnight. Henry walked away thinking she had spent too many months alone on the claim. But Clara was observing something real. Something that any settler could have noticed if they had stopped to press their hand against the outside of their own cabin wall on a cold morning and asked themselves why the surface was not as cold as the air around it. The outer surface of a log wall in a heated cabin is almost never as cold as the open air. Even at 20 below zero outside, the exterior face of a well-built log wall can sit 10 to 15 degrees warmer than the ambient temperature because some of the interior heat is conducting outward through the wood. The log is losing heat, that is the problem, but it is also briefly storing it. Wood has a modest but real thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. The problem with the standard frontier cabin was not that the wood could not store heat at all. The problem was that 8 inches of log wall did not have enough mass to store meaningful amounts of it, and it had no insulating layer to slow the rate of loss. The wood was doing two jobs at once, trying to be both the container and the insulation, and it was failing at both because it was not enough material to succeed at either. Clara understood this in the way a cooper's daughter understands it, not through equations or formulas, but through the feel of it, through the experience of pressing her hand against wood, and knowing from the warmth under her palm that energy was moving, was always moving, and that the question was never whether you could stop it, but whether you could slow it down enough to matter. What if you could add mass to the wall, significant mass, without rebuilding the cabin from scratch? What if you could fill the space between the log face and the interior lining with something dense enough to absorb heat during the hours when the fire burned hot, and release it slowly during the long cold hours after the fire died down to coals? Not a barrier that tried to stop the movement of heat entirely, because nothing stops it entirely, but a reservoir that captured it on the way out and held it long enough for the family inside to sleep through the night without waking to feed the fire. The material she arrived at was the one thing the Dakota plains offered in essentially unlimited supply, not sod, which was heavy and wet and would rot inside a wall cavity before Christmas, not stone, which was scarce on the open plain and required equipment she did not have, not grass, which was light and would compress to nothing within weeks and would burn at the first spark. Firewood itself. The idea crystallized for her sometime in late September of 1885. By her own account, recorded in a brief journal entry, her granddaughter donated to a local historical society. Decades later, she wrote the words that would, if anyone had been paying attention, have described a principle that building scientists would not formally codify for another 100 years. The wood outside holds no heat because it is outside. The wood inside the stove becomes heat and vanishes. But wood packed tight inside the wall, that is something else. That is a battery. She used the word battery in its older mechanical sense, a stored potential, a reservoir of capacity waiting to be called upon. But the physics she was describing in plain frontier language was thermal mass, the capacity of a dense material to absorb thermal energy over time and release it over a longer period, buffering the interior temperature against the wild swings between fire on and fire out that made every other cabin in Tillman Creek a place where warmth existed only as long as someone was awake to produce it. A battery, a wall that could be charged with the heat of the evening and discharge it slowly through the coldest hours of the night. The idea was simple enough to write in a single journal entry, and strange enough that not one person in Tillman Creek, when they heard about it in the weeks that followed, believed it would work. The distance between having an idea and building it into a wall is measured in different units depending on who you are and where you are standing. For a man with a crew and a sawmill and a supply line, it is measured in days. For a woman alone on a Dakota homestead claim in October of 1885, with winter closing in and no one willing to help with a project they considered foolish, it is measured in something harder to quantify. Stubbornness, maybe. or the particular kind of faith that comes not from optimism but from arithmetic, from having done the calculations in your head and on paper and against the wall itself, and arriving each time at the same answer, an answer that no one else has arrived at, because no one else has asked the question. Clara asked the question, and having asked it, she could not unask it. The numbers worked, the logic held. The wood she needed was already stacked in cords beside her cabin, seasoned through the summer dry and dense, and waiting to be burned in a stove that would waste most of its energy sending heat up through a chimney into a sky that did not need it. She looked at that woodpile on the last day of September the way she later described it, and saw it differently than she had ever seen it before. Not as fuel waiting to be consumed, but as mass waiting to be positioned. Not as something that would become heat and vanish, but as something that could hold heat and persist. The difference between those two ideas, between burning and holding, between consuming and storing, was the distance between the way every cabin in Tillman Creek worked and the way hers was about to work. She did not tell anyone what she was planning, not because she was secretive by nature, but because she had already learned in her months on the claim that explanations cost time she did not have, and produced objections she would have to spend more time answering. October on the Dakota Plains is not a month that waits for consensus. The ground freezes by the end of it. The first snow can come at any point after the 10th. Every day spent talking about what she intended to build was a day not spent building it. And Clara Holbrook had her father's instinct for the difference between the work of the hands and the work of the mouth. The hands built things. The mouth built arguments. She had never seen an argument keep anyone warm past midnight. She began on the first day of October. She would work alone for the next 26 days from first light until the fading afternoon pushed her inside, disassembling the interior of her cabin and rebuilding it around an idea that existed nowhere else on the northern plains. The cottonwood leaves along the creek bed had already turned gold, and the wind that pressed against her cabin walls each night was growing colder in a way that felt less like a season changing and more like a deadline arriving steady and indifferent and absolutely certain of its schedule. Clara began on the north wall because the north wall was the enemy. Every cabin in Tillman Creek had a north wall that behaved differently from the other three. It was the face that caught the prevailing winter wind. Head on, the face where frost formed first and melted last. The face where chinking cracked earliest in the season, because the temperature differential between inside and outside was greatest there, pulling the mud and grass mixture apart, the way a river pulls apart a sandbar grain by grain, gap by gap, until by December, the north wall of a standard cabin was less a wall than a series of logs with suggestions of filling between them. Clara had studied her north wall through the summer, with the same attention her father had given to a barrel stave he suspected of hiding a flaw. She knew where the drafts entered. She knew which logs had shrunk most across their grain during the dry months. She knew that the bottom three courses, the logs closest to the frozen ground, would lose heat fastest because cold air pooled along the floor and conducted downward through the sill logs into earth that by January would be frozen solid to a depth of 4 feet. The north wall was where winter would attack first and hardest, and it was where she would build her defense. She pulled the interior board lining off in sections, working carefully, because the boards were rough-sawn pine she had purchased in Bismarck at considerable expense and could not afford to split or crack. Each board came away from the furring strips with the reluctant groan of nails releasing from dry wood, and as each section opened, the cavity behind it exhaled the stale smell of dust and mouse droppings and the faint mineral scent of the clay chinking that had already begun to powder at its edges. The cavity she revealed was shallow, barely 3 inches deep, the standard gap that settlers left between the log face and the interior lining. She could fit her hand inside it, fingers splayed, and touch the back of the log with her palm, while her knuckles pressed against the furring strip. That was the entire depth of insulation that stood between a heated room and a Dakota winter. The width of a woman's hand. She pulled every furring strip off the north wall and then off the west wall. The second most exposed face, the one that caught the crosswinds that swept down from the northwest in the early hours before dawn, when temperatures dropped fastest. She stacked the strips in a pile outside the door. Then she stood in her cabin and looked at the bare log walls, the interior faces rough and unfinished, the chinking visible between every course, and she felt for the first time the full vulnerability of the structure she was living inside. Without the lining, without even the thin pretense of that 3-inch air gap, the cabin was just logs. Just wood standing between her and a winter that could reach 40 below without exertion. She reset the furring strips at 16 inches from the log face instead of 3. This was the modification that changed everything. And it was so simple in execution that describing it takes longer than doing it took. She cut new furring strips from scrap lumber longer than the originals and nailed them to the log face at 16-inch intervals running vertically from sill to plate. Each strip projected 16 inches into the room. When she nailed the horizontal lining boards to the face of these extended strips, she would create a cavity behind the lining that was 16 inches deep instead of 3, a space nearly 1.5 feet wide, running the full length and height of both walls. The cost was floor space. The north wall, 18 feet long, would lose approximately 24 square feet of interior area. The west wall, 16 feet, would lose roughly 21 square feet. 45 square feet total out of a cabin that measured 288 square feet before the modification. She would be giving up nearly 16% of her living space, and in a single-room cabin, where every square foot served as bedroom, kitchen, workspace, and storage, that was not a trivial sacrifice. She made it without hesitation because floor space could not keep her alive in February, and what she was about to put inside those cavities could. The firewood she selected for the wall cavities was not the same wood she burned in her stove. She had been preparing it separately since midsummer, choosing pieces with the deliberateness of her father, selecting staves for a whiskey barrel. Each piece had to meet 3 criteria that she had worked out through her observations and her reasoning, and she rejected any piece that failed even one of them. First, it had to be fully seasoned. She used only wood that had been cut and split the previous spring and stacked in open air through the full summer, exposed to sun and wind until the moisture content had dropped below 20%. She tested this the way her father had tested barrel staves, by feel, by weight, by the sound the wood made when she knocked 2 pieces together. Green wood thudded, dry wood rang. She wanted wood that rang. Second, it had to be split, not round. Round logs leave circular gaps when stacked gaps that fill with air and create convection channels. Split faces nest against each other with far less void space. She wanted density. She wanted mass. Every pocket of air inside the wall cavity was a pocket that would not absorb heat, and she was building a reservoir, not a sieve. Third, it had to be hardwood. She used primarily cottonwood, which was the most available species from the river breaks, and a smaller quantity of elm that she had managed to source from a stand along the bluffs where the creek turned east. Cottonwood is not a true hardwood by the standards of eastern forests, not oak, not maple, not the dense, slow-growing species her father had worked with in Wisconsin. But it was denser than pine, denser than the soft, dry grass that other settlers stuffed into their wall cavities when they stuffed them with anything at all, and it could absorb a meaningful amount of thermal energy before its temperature changed appreciably. It would not hold heat the way stone would, but she did not have stone. She had cottonwood, and cottonwood was enough if she used enough of it. She stacked the split pieces horizontally into the wall cavity bark, side facing outward toward the exterior log wall, cut face inward toward the room. Each piece measured between 14 and 16 inches long, fitting the cavity depth almost exactly with just enough clearance to slide into position without forcing. She packed them row by row from floor to ceiling, each row seated firmly against the one below it, the irregular shapes of split wood interlocking with the imperfect precision of a dry stone wall. Where gaps remained between pieces, she tamped dry grass and wood shavings into the voids, pressing the filler tight with a flat stick until the cavity was packed as solidly as she could make it by hand. The work was slow. Each row required selecting pieces that fit together well, testing them against each other, rejecting combinations that left too much void space, sometimes splitting a piece further to create a flatter face that would seat more tightly against its neighbor. Her hands developed new calluses on top of the old ones across her palms, where the rough bark dragged at the base of her thumbs, where she pressed the filler into the gaps. She worked from first light until the afternoon shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, stopping only to eat to water Dutch and to split more wood for the next morning's work. By the end of the first week of October, the north wall cavity was half filled. By the middle of the second week, it was complete, packed from sill log to top plate with approximately 2,000 pounds of dry split hardwood. A mass so dense that when she pressed her palm against it, the surface felt almost like stone, unyielding and solid and faintly cool in the autumn air. She moved to the west wall and repeated the process. This wall was 2 feet shorter in length, but presented its own challenges. The stovepipe passed through the west wall near the northwest corner, and she had to frame around the thimble where the pipe exited, leaving a clearance of 8 inches on every side between the packed wood and the nearest surface of the metal pipe. This was the fire precaution she had thought through most carefully. The stovepipe was the only component in her cabin that reached temperatures high enough to ignite wood by direct contact, and she treated it with the respect of someone who understood exactly what she was packing into her walls and exactly what it would do if flame ever found its way there. 8 inches of dead air around the thimble. No wood, no grass, no filler of any kind within that clearance zone. The pipe would pass through the wall surrounded by nothing but space, and the packed wood mass would begin only beyond that perimeter. She finished the west wall cavity on the 22nd of October. 4 days remained before the end of the month, and she used them to address the second technical problem she had identified during her planning, the one that would become the centerpiece of every objection her neighbors would raise: moisture. Clara understood moisture migration in wood, the way any cooper's daughter would, instinctively and practically through years of watching what happened when wet wood was placed against dry wood in an enclosed space. Moisture moves through wood. It moves from wet areas to dry areas. It moves from warm surfaces to cold surfaces. And in a wall assembly, where one side faces a heated room and the other side faces a Dakota winter, the moisture in the interior air will try to migrate outward through the wall, driven by vapor pressure, toward the cold exterior face. If that moisture reaches a surface cold enough to condense it, the water collects. Wet wood rots, rot spreads. The wall fails from the inside invisibly, silently, and by the time the damage becomes apparent, the structure is already compromised beyond simple repair. She addressed this with 2 decisions that she made before she packed the first piece of wood into the first cavity. The first was the wood itself. Fully seasoned split hardwood at less than 20% moisture content does not readily absorb additional moisture from ambient air. It resists it. The cellular structure of dry wood, the collapsed fibers and empty vessels from which the original moisture has been driven by months of sun and wind, does not reopen easily. Moisture can enter, but it enters slowly and in a cavity packed densely enough to limit air circulation. The rate of moisture absorption is slow enough that it does not become problematic within a single season. Clara was not building for decades. She was building for one winter, with the option to inspect and repack the cavity each autumn if the method proved sound. The second was a gap. She left 2 inches of open space between the packed wood mass and the interior board lining. Not a sealed pocket, but a continuous vertical channel running the full height of the wall on the warm side of the assembly, the side facing the heated room. Warm air from the room would enter this channel, at the bottom absorb any moisture vapor, migrating outward from the room through the board lining, and rise naturally to the top of the wall, carrying the moisture with it, and venting through small gaps she left unsealed at the top plate, where the wall met the ceiling. The moisture would escape into the attic space and dissipate through the roof, never accumulating inside the wall cavity, never reaching the packed wood mass, never beginning the cycle of condensation and rot that would have destroyed the assembly within 2 seasons. She finished the interior board lining on the 25th of October, and sealed every seam between the boards with a mixture of clay and grass fiber she had prepared through the summer, working the mixture into the joints with a flat knife until the surface was as tight as she could make it. When she stepped back and looked at the finished interior, the cabin appeared completely normal. The walls looked like walls. The floor space was noticeably reduced, the room feeling narrower in a way that would take a few days to adjust to. But the surfaces were clean and tight and showed no evidence of what lay behind them. What was invisible was the approximately 4,000 pounds of tightly packed dry hardwood now embedded in the two most exposed faces of her home, waiting. Word travels through a small settlement, the way smoke travels through a cabin with bad chinking, finding every gap, filling every space impossible to contain once it starts moving. Henry Dahl had noticed Clara hauling split wood into her cabin, rather than stacking it beside her door, and he had mentioned it to his wife Ruth over supper one evening in the second week of October. Ruth had mentioned it to the family at the adjacent claim the following morning. By the end of that week, the information had passed through every household in Tillman Creek, acquiring in each retelling the particular distortion that unusual ideas undergo in tight-knit communities, where entertainment is scarce and winter is approaching, and people are looking for something to talk about that is not the price of wheat or the condition of the trail. The version of Clara's project that circulated through the settlement by late October bore only a passing resemblance to what she had actually built. The story as it traveled described her packing her walls floor to ceiling with raw green timber unseasoned and dripping with sap, and then sealing the whole thing shut with a layer of clay so thick that the walls bulged inward. The green timber detail was pure invention, contributed by someone along the chain of retelling, who assumed that no one would waste seasoned firewood on an experiment when it could be burned in a stove instead. The bulging clay was embellishment, the kind of vivid physical detail that attaches itself to stories in communities where people are predisposed to see a project as foolish and need the visual evidence to match their expectation. The reaction was swift, and by the account of several neighbors recorded in regional oral history collections from the early 20th century, it was genuinely alarmed. This was not simple mockery, not the easy laughter that frontier communities directed at minor eccentricities. Some of the concern came from people who had real construction experience, and their objections were technically coherent, which made them far more difficult to dismiss than ridicule would have been. Silas Redmond walked over to Clara's claim on a cold afternoon in the last week of October. He was a man whose opinion mattered in Tillman Creek, not because he was loud or forceful, but because he had been building frontier structures across the Dakota Territory for nearly 15 years by that point. And in that time, he had earned the authority that comes only from having done a thing long enough to have seen every way it can go wrong. He was 51 years old. He had built his own cabin and helped build 7 others in the settlement. He had watched walls fail, roofs collapse, foundations shift in the frost heave, and chimneys crack from thermal stress. He did not offer his opinions freely, and when he did offer them, people listened because his opinions were purchased with experience, and experience on the Dakota frontier was expensive. He stood inside Clara's modified cabin for a long time. He pressed his hand against the new interior lining, feeling for flex, for give, for the faint vibration that might indicate the boards were carrying more weight than they were designed to support. He tapped the surface with his knuckle, listening to the dead sound that dense-packed wood produces when struck through a board, a sound nothing like the hollow resonance of an empty cavity. He ran his fingers along the sealed seams where Clara had worked the clay mixture into the joints. He said nothing while he did these things, and Clara stood near her stove and watched him, and said nothing either, because she understood that this was not a social call, and that Silas Redmond was reading her walls the way she had spent the summer reading everyone else's. When he finished, he stepped back to the center of the small room and delivered his verdict in the measured, regretful tone of a man who does not enjoy being the bearer of bad news, but considers it a responsibility he cannot ethically avoid. The wood would rot. That was his first and primary concern. packed tight against the log exterior wall with no ventilation, sealed inside a closed cavity. The moisture that naturally migrated through a log structure during winter would have nowhere to go. The vapor pressure differential between the warm interior and the frozen exterior would drive moisture inward through the outer logs into the packed wood mass, where it would condense against the cold surfaces and saturate the firewood within 2 or 3 seasons. Rotted wood insulates poorly. Worse, rotted wood in an enclosed wall cavity breeds decay that spreads silently through the structure until the wall fails entirely, and by then the damage is beyond repair. His voice carried the weight of a man who had watched this exact process destroy cabins built by men who thought they knew what they were doing. He was not guessing, he was remembering. His second concern was fire. Dry hardwood packed into a wall cavity was fuel waiting for a path to ignition. A chimney fire, a stovepipe overheating at the thimble where it passed through the wall, a spark from a failing flue seal. Any of these could find its way to the wood mass inside the wall and produce a structural fire that would burn from the inside out invisible until the wall was fully involved and the cabin was beyond saving. His eyes moved to the northwest corner where the stovepipe exited through the west wall, and his expression tightened in a way that communicated more than his words did. "You won't see it coming. By the time you smell it, it's already in the wall." Clara heard him out without interrupting. She had anticipated both objections during the weeks she spent planning the modification, had thought through them with the methodical patience of someone who understood that a good idea that kills you is worse than a bad idea. You survive. She had answers. The seasoned wood, the moisture content, the ventilation channel, the 8-inch clearance around the stovepipe thimble. Every concern Silas raised she had already addressed in her design. But she said none of it. She recognized something in the way Silas delivered his assessment that told her a verbal rebuttal would accomplish nothing. He had not come to have a conversation. He had come to deliver a warning, and a warning once delivered has a completeness to it that does not invite response. He was satisfied that he had done the responsible thing. Arguing with him would not change his mind, because his mind was not the kind that changed through argument. It changed through evidence, through winters, through the slow accumulation of physical proof that could not be talked away or reasoned around. She poured him coffee from the pot on her stove. He accepted it. They stood in her narrowed cabin, drinking from tin cups, and neither of them mentioned the walls again. When he left, he thanked her for the coffee and pulled his collar up against the wind that was already sharpening towards something colder. And Clara watched him walk down the shallow rise toward the main cluster of cabins, and thought that he was probably right about a great many things, and that this was not one of them. 2 other men from the settlement stopped by in the following days with variations of Silas's arguments. One, a younger man named Porter, who had arrived in the territory the same year as Clara, pointed out that the reduced interior space would create uneven heating. The corners farthest from the stove would stay cold regardless of what she had packed into the walls, he reasoned, because the room was now too narrow for the stove's radiant heat to distribute evenly. The other, an older settler, whose name the oral histories record only as Gunderson, simply shook his head when Clara showed him the finished wall and told her she was throwing away good firewood she would need by February. Clara thanked each of them. She offered each of them coffee. She went back to sealing the last of the wall seams after each of them left. Words were wind. Winter was weight. She would let the heavier things speak. The winter of 1885 to 1886 did not arrive gradually on the northern Dakota plains. It arrived the way the worst winters always do in that region, without sufficient warning, and with the particular cruelty of a season that seems to understand exactly how much preparation its victims have made and calibrates its severity to exceed it. The first serious cold came the 3rd week of November, a full week earlier than the previous year, and noticeably harder, the kind of cold that announces itself not through the thermometer, but through the sounds the landscape makes. The creek bed, which had been slowly freezing since late October, in the quiet way that water surrenders to cold when it has given up hope of flowing, cracked loudly enough on the night of November 19th to wake Henry Dahl's dogs. The ground, which had been merely firm for weeks, became something closer to iron. A shovel blade bounced off it. A fence post driven with a maul required twice the effort it had taken in October. The earth itself was locking shut for the winter, sealing its surface against everything above it. And the message was clear to anyone who had lived through even one Dakota season. What was coming would be worse than what was here. It was always worse than what was here. By the end of November, temperatures at Tillman Creek had dropped to 18 below zero on multiple consecutive nights. By the second week of December, the thermometer outside the post office was reading 28 below before midnight, and the wind was driving snow horizontally across the plain, in conditions that made the walk between neighboring claims a genuine gamble with frostbite and disorientation. A person could step out their door and lose sight of the nearest cabin within 30 yards if the snow was moving fast enough. And on the worst nights, the snow was always moving fast enough. Livestock that had survived previous winters did not survive this one. Cattle froze standing up in pens that had provided adequate shelter in milder years. Root cellars that had kept potatoes and turnips through 3 previous seasons failed to hold temperature, and families opened their stores in December to find vegetables frozen solid, their cellular structure destroyed, usable for nothing but cattle feed, if there were any cattle left alive to feed. Firewood supplies began to fail. The calculations that every family had made in October, based on the consumption rates of the 3 previous winters, proved insufficient for a season that was exceeding all precedent. Silas Redmond's cabin, a well-built structure with die chinking and a reasonably efficient box stove, was consuming between 1 and 1.5 cords of wood per week by mid-December. At that rate, his 10-cord supply would carry him to late February at best, leaving March, the month the old-timers called the starving month, the month when cold persists but firewood does not, dangerously uncovered. The pattern held across the settlement. Families were burning between 0.8 of a cord and 1 and 4/10 cords per week, depending on cabin size and stove efficiency. Interior overnight temperatures dropped to somewhere between 38 and 48 degrees in the hours before dawn. Cold enough to see breath indoors. Cold enough that children slept in their coats under every blanket the family owned, and still woke shivering. Clara Holbrook's cabin was operating on a different schedule entirely. Her cast-iron parlor stove, smaller than the box stove Silas Redmond ran in his own cabin, was burning at a rate that her journal entries from December and January suggest was roughly half to 2/3 of what her neighbors were consuming. She loaded it in the early evening, fed it steadily through the hours before midnight, and let it drop to cold sometime around 2 in the morning. In every other cabin in Tillman Creek, that was the moment when the night turned dangerous, when the temperature began its steep slide toward the 30s, and someone had to drag themselves out of bed to keep the fire alive. In Clara's cabin, 2 in the morning was not a crisis. It was a transition. The stove dropped to coals and the active heat source faded, and the room should have begun its plunge toward the temperature of the outside air. But Clara's walls were not surrendering their heat the way every other wall in the settlement did. They had been absorbing warmth all evening, 4,000 pounds of dry, dense wood soaking up energy degree by slow degree through the board lining. And now, with the fire dying, they began to give it back. Not quickly, not in a burst. In the slow, patient way that mass releases energy, the way a stone that has sat in the sun all afternoon radiates warmth into the cool evening air long after the sun has set. The temperature dropped, yes. Physics is not optional. But it dropped along a gentle slope instead of a cliff. And the difference between those two curves was the difference between a family that slept through the night and a family that did not. But there were nights when even Clara doubted. The 3rd week of December brought a stretch of cold that exceeded anything the settlement had recorded. 3 consecutive nights below 35 under zero, with wind that found frequencies in the cabin walls. Clara had never heard before a low moaning vibration that seemed to come from the wood itself, as though the logs were protesting the temperature differential being forced across their grain. On the second of those nights, Clara woke at 3 in the morning. Not because she was cold, the cabin was holding at 52 degrees, still 10 degrees warmer than any other structure in Tillman Creek. but because she could not stop thinking about Silas Redmond's voice. "You won't see it coming." She lay in the dark listening to the wind and wondering whether somewhere inside those walls, in a gap she had missed, or a seam that had shifted moisture was collecting silently against wood that would be gray and soft by spring. She did not get up to check. There was nothing to check in the dark and nothing she could do about it at 3 in the morning in 35 below. But she lay awake for an hour thinking about it. And that hour was the only time during the entire winter when the distance between her confidence in the arithmetic and her fear of being wrong felt truly narrow. By morning, the cabin was at 54 degrees. She loaded the stove and started her day, and did not think about Silas's warning again until April, when the answer came. Her estimated weekly wood consumption through December and January ran between roughly half a cord and 6/10 of a cord, approximately 40 to 55% of what Silas was burning in a comparable cabin with a larger stove. She was running her fire for 6 to 8 hours and getting 14 to 16 hours of useful heat from each burn cycle. The wall was doing exactly what her journal had predicted. It was remembering. Henry Dahl came to Clara's cabin on a morning in the 3rd week of January, when the thermometer outside the post office had not been readable since the previous afternoon, because the mercury had retreated into the bulb and refused to climb back up the glass. The best estimate anyone could offer was somewhere below 30 degrees under zero, a temperature arrived at not by measurement, but by consensus among men who had lived through enough Dakota winters to calibrate cold against the behavior of metal and leather and spit. Below 30 negative, a leather harness strap left outside overnight will snap like a dry twig when bent. Below 30 negative, spit freezes before it reaches the ground if you are standing in wind. The wind had not stopped in 4 days. Henry did not come because he was curious about Clara's wall design. He came because his own cabin had dropped to 31 degrees overnight, and his youngest daughter, who was 4 years old and had been coughing since Christmas, had woken before dawn with frost on the blanket covering her face. The frost had formed from her own breath, condensing and freezing on the wool within inches of her mouth, and the sight of it had done something to Henry that all the cold and all the hardship of the previous weeks had not managed to do. It had frightened him, not the distant, manageable fear of a man who knows the winter will be hard, but believes he can outlast it. The immediate physical fear of a father who is looking at evidence that the air inside his home is no longer meaningfully different from the air outside it. He crossed the distance between his cabin and Clara's in the gray light, before full sunrise, walking with his shoulders hunched and his face wrapped in a scarf that had frozen stiff against his mouth. The snow crunched under his boots with the high-pitched squeal that snow only makes below 20 negative, and the wind cut through his coat at every seam as though the fabric were not there. He reached Clara's door and knocked, and when she opened it, the warmth that came through the doorway hit him with a force that made him step back involuntarily, not because it was unpleasant, but because it was so jarringly different from the air he had been breathing for the past 5 minutes, that his body responded to the contrast before his mind could process it. She gestured him inside. He entered and stood on the packed earth floor near the door, and for a long moment he did not speak. He was taking inventory of the room with the eyes of a man who was comparing everything he saw against the interior of his own cabin and finding differences he could not immediately explain. The stove was small, smaller than his own, a simple cast-iron parlor model with a flat top and a single door. It was burning, but not aggressively. The coals inside glowed through the draft vents with a steady amber light that suggested a moderate fire, not the roaring full-load burn that every other stove in Tillman Creek was running at maximum capacity. The air in the room was warm enough that Clara was working in a cotton blouse with her sleeves pushed above her elbows. No coat, no shawl. Her hands, when she poured him coffee from a pot on the stovetop, were bare and did not tremble. He estimated the temperature at something above 60 degrees, possibly 65. In a cabin with a stove half the size of his burning, at what appeared to be half the rate on a morning when his own home had dropped to 31. Henry wrapped both hands around the tin cup and held it without drinking. The warmth of the metal against his fingers was almost painful after the cold. Outside, a sharp tingling that traveled up his wrists and into his forearms as the blood vessels in his hands reopened. He stood there for what felt like a long time, and then he said something that Clara's granddaughter, decades later, would recount as the moment her grandmother knew the wall had proven itself to the only jury that mattered. "How is this possible? My cabin is 10 feet wider and I cannot keep it above freezing." Clara did not explain, not yet. She poured him a second cup when he finished the first, and she let the room make the argument she had decided months ago to let it make. Henry sat on the bench near the stove and unbuttoned his coat, because the heat made wearing it uncomfortable, and the simple act of a man removing his outer garments inside a frontier cabin in January carried in this context the weight of proof. He was comfortable. He was warm. The walls around him were doing something that the walls of his own cabin could not do, and Henry Dahl was not a man who required things to be explained to him more than once. He was a farmer. He understood inputs and outputs. He understood that if two systems produced different results from similar resources, the difference lay in the design, not in luck. He asked to see the wall. Clara pulled back a section of the interior lining she had designed to be removable for exactly this purpose, lifting the boards away from the furring strips to reveal the packed wood mass behind them. Henry leaned forward and looked. He reached out and touched the face of the packed firewood, pressing his fingers against the cut surface of a cottonwood split that had been sitting in that cavity since October. He held his hand there for several seconds. The wood was dry, not damp, not discolored. The ventilation channel she had built on the warm side of the assembly was doing what she had designed it to do, carrying moisture upward and out before it could settle and condense. Henry replaced the lining boards carefully. He finished his coffee. He buttoned his coat, and before he left, standing in the doorway with the cold already reaching in past him, he looked at Clara and asked her a question that contained in its phrasing the quiet admission that he had been wrong about her for the better part of a year. "Will you show me how to build this into my north wall before next winter?" It was not a question that required an answer. They both knew what she would say. February came to Tillman Creek without mercy, and without any sign that it was aware of the calendar or cared that the people enduring it had already been cold for 3 months and were running out of the resources to stay warm. The temperatures did not moderate. The wind did not relent. The snow continued to build against every vertical surface until some cabins were buried to the window sills on their north and west faces, and the doors had to be shoveled clear every morning before anyone could step outside. The firewood crisis that had been building since December reached its full severity in the second week of February. 3 families had exhausted their primary wood supplies entirely. Silas Redmond was down to his last cord and a half, and it would not carry him through March. He had begun burning furniture. The table his wife had brought from their previous homestead, a piece of pine furniture that had no practical value as fuel, but whose destruction represented something worse than the loss of an object. It represented the acknowledgement that the system had failed, that the preparations had been insufficient, that the winter had won. 2 families organized emergency hauling trips to the river breaks, in conditions that the oral histories describe with the understated precision of people who understood that exaggeration was unnecessary when the facts were already extreme. 12 miles round trip in wind chill that put the effective temperature somewhere near 50 below. Trails drifted shut. A wagon axle cracked on the second trip when it struck a frozen rut concealed under snow, and the repair took 3 hours with bare hands on metal so cold it pulled skin off on contact. Porter's eldest son, who was 17 and had been on every hauling trip since October, developed frostbite on 4 fingers of his right hand during the axle repair and would lose feeling in 2 of them permanently. Clara Holbrook did not make any emergency trips in February. Her supply, which had stood at roughly 3.5 cords at the end of January, continued to diminish at the same measured rate it had maintained since November. She burned a little less than half a cord per week. Her stove ran at moderate output for 6 to 8 hours each evening, and her cabin stayed above 50 degrees at its coldest point before dawn every morning, while the settlement around her shivered through the 30s and the 20s, and on the worst nights the teens. By the end of February, when several families had stripped interior wall boards for fuel, and the Marsh family had once again begun dismantling parts of their own shelter to feed the fire that was supposed to protect it, Clara still had more than 2 cords remaining. She would finish the winter with a cord and a half to spare. The firewood inside her walls had never been touched. It had done its work not as fuel, but as infrastructure, the part of the system that persisted while everything else was consumed. Spring came late to Tillman Creek in 1886. It came the way spring always comes after a hard winter on the northern plains, not as a season, but as a slow, grudging negotiation between cold and warmth, in which cold makes concessions 1 degree at a time and takes most of them back overnight. March was still winter by any honest measure. April was mud and uncertainty. The creek bed thawed and refroze and thawed again, and the sound of running water when it finally came sometime in the 2nd week of April was a sound that several families later described as the most welcome thing they had ever heard. And with the thaw came conversation. The particular kind of conversation that follows a season of genuine difficulty. Honest, quiet, and specific in a way that people are rarely specific when things are going well. During good times, talk is general. During hard times, talk is precise. People who have just survived something want to understand exactly how they survived it and exactly what they will do differently before the next time. Because on the Dakota plains, there was always a next time. Silas Redmond was among the first to come to Clara's cabin that April. He came without announcement in the early morning the way he had come in October. But everything about his bearing was different. In October, he had come with the authority of a man who knew what he was about to see was wrong. In April, he came with the bearing of a man who knew what he was about to see was right, and was trying to reconcile that knowledge with 6 months of certainty that it would fail. He asked to see the wall cavities. Clara pulled back the removable section of interior lining on the north wall, the same section she had shown Henry in January, and stepped aside. Silas stood for a long time looking at the tightly packed firewood inside. He did not touch it immediately. He looked at the 2-inch ventilation channel between the wood mass and the back of the board lining. He looked at the gaps she had left at the top plate for moisture venting. He looked at the way the split pieces interlocked bark side-out cut face in the gaps chinked with dry grass that was still dry, still firmly packed, still doing its job after 5 months of winter. Then he reached in and pressed his palm against the interior face of the wood mass and held it there. The wood was cool to the touch as it should have been in a cabin whose stove had been cold since the previous evening. But it was not cold, not the deep penetrating cold of wood that has absorbed moisture and lost its capacity to resist temperature change. It was the neutral stable cool of dense dry material at equilibrium, with the room around it ready to absorb warmth again the moment the stove was lit, ready to begin the cycle again, as though winter had not tested it and spring had not arrived. And the whole process were as natural and as unremarkable as the wood itself. No rot, no mold, no discoloration, no structural damage of any kind. The wood Clara had packed into her walls in October of 1885 had come through 5 months of the hardest winter the settlement had recorded in the same condition it had entered. Silas Redmond's prediction, offered in good faith and based on 15 years of legitimate experience, had been wrong. Not because his experience was invalid, but because Clara had solved the problem his experience was based on. She had managed the moisture. She had designed around the failure mode he had correctly identified. She had taken his objection seriously enough to engineer a response to it before he ever raised it. He held his palm against the wood for a long time. Then he withdrew his hand and asked Clara to explain from the beginning exactly how she had managed the moisture gap on the warm side of the assembly. His voice carried no defensiveness, no reluctance, none of the guardedness of a man protecting his authority. It carried curiosity, pure, unguarded professional curiosity, the kind that only emerges when a person's desire to understand something exceeds their need to have been right about it. Clara explained. She started with the ventilation channel and worked outward, describing the logic of each decision, the reasoning behind the 2-inch gap. The purpose of the unsealed sections at the top plate the selection criteria for the wood itself. The way seasoned hardwood resists moisture absorption. The way her father had taught her to read wood by weight and by sound. She spoke clearly and without rushing the way a person speaks when they have been waiting months for someone to ask the right questions and are determined to answer them completely. Silas asked 2 or 3 technical questions. They were precise questions. The kind of questions a builder asks when he is not looking for reasons to disagree, but is genuinely trying to understand a system he has never encountered before and wants to be able to replicate. How deep was the channel at its narrowest point? How had she sealed the bottom of the cavity against ground moisture, wicking upward through the sill logs? Had she noticed any differential in performance between the north wall, which faced the prevailing wind, and the west wall, which caught the cross drafts? Clara answered each one. The channel was consistent at 2 inches maintained by the offset of the furring strips. She had laid a strip of bark along the top of the sill log before packing the first row of firewood, creating a moisture break between the ground contact timber and the dry packed mass above it. The north wall performed slightly better than the west in terms of heat retention, which she attributed to its greater length and therefore greater mass. Though the west wall's performance was still dramatically superior to any unmodified wall in the settlement. Silas nodded slowly when she finished. He looked at the packed wood one more time. Then he turned to face her and told her in the paraphrase that has survived through 4 generations of Tillman Creek descendants that he had built walls for 15 years, and he had never seen a wall that worked the way hers did, and that if she was willing to show him the full construction sequence, he intended to modify his own cabin before the following October. It was enough. Over the following summer, 3 families in the settlement modified their own cabin walls, using variations of Clara's method. Henry Dahl was first rebuilding the north and west walls of his cabin, with a 14-inch packed wood cavity following her basic approach, but substituting a portion of the wood mass with flat field stone he gathered from the creek bed during the weeks after the spring thaw. Stone holds more energy per cubic foot than wood before its temperature rises, though it is significantly heavier and harder to source in quantity on the open plains. His modification, by his own account in a letter to his brother in Minnesota that summer, reduced his wood consumption the following winter by what he estimated as 1/3 compared to his previous practice. His youngest daughter's cough did not return. The Kessler family, who had arrived late in the 1885 season and had not yet finished their cabin interior, when winter drove them indoors, built the modified wall assembly from scratch rather than retrofitting it. A considerably easier process that allowed them to set the cavity depth and the ventilation channel as part of the original construction, rather than tearing out existing work and rebuilding it. Their version used a 12-inch cavity packed with split cottonwood and chinked with dry grass and clay, with the ventilated channel on the interior face that Clara had pioneered. Their first full winter in the modified cabin was, by their account, the warmest either of them had experienced in any frontier structure. The Kessler children slept through the night without waking. Their stove burned at a rate that left them by March with nearly a quarter of their original wood supply untouched. A third family modified a single wall, the north face only using a shallower cavity and a mix of wood and dried sod. Their results were less dramatic, but still measurable, a reduction in overnight temperature drop that they described as noticeable, and a wood savings they estimated at roughly 1/5. Silas Redmond modified both his north and west walls that August, working with a precision and care that reflected both his 15 years of construction experience and his complete conversion to the method he had once predicted would fail. His cavity depth was 16 inches, the same as Clara's. His wood selection was, if anything, more rigorous than hers. His ventilation channel was exactly 2 inches maintained, with a consistency that bordered on obsessive. He told no one how his cabin performed the following winter, but Henry Dahl reported visiting in January of 1887 and finding the interior warm enough to sit in shirt sleeves, and Silas did not make a single emergency trip to the river breaks that season or any season after. The technique did not spread beyond the immediate settlement in any documented way. There was no newspaper article, no agricultural extension bulletin, no published account that carried Clara Holbrook's name or her method to the wider territory or beyond. The frontier did not work that way. Knowledge on the plains traveled, the way heat traveled through Clara's walls slowly through direct contact, one surface passing it to the next, losing intensity with distance but never entirely disappearing. What spread instead was what always spreads in frontier communities: practical knowledge passed from neighbor to neighbor, adapted and modified by each new pair of hands that applied it, losing its origin story and keeping its function. A family in a settlement 40 miles south heard about a cabin near Tillman Creek that stayed warm on half the firewood and sent a son to ask about it. The son returned with instructions that were approximately correct and built a version that was approximately effective. That family told another family. That family told a third. The method drifted across the plains the way seeds drift, landing where conditions allowed taking root, where someone was willing to try producing variations that the original designer would have recognized in principle, if not in every detail. This is how most of the best frontier engineering traveled. Not through publication, not through formal instruction, not through the mechanisms that history uses to remember things, but through demonstration. One cabin standing warmer than its neighbors through one hard winter, and a community of observant, practical people who understood how to learn from what they could see with their own eyes. The cabin at Tillman Creek stood for another 19 years after that first winter, through seasons that were milder and seasons that were worse, through the transition from territory to statehood, through the slow transformation of the northern plains from frontier to farmland. Clara proved up her claim within the 5-year window required by federal law. She raised a garden that sustained her through the growing months, and a reputation that sustained her through the rest. She was known in the settlement and in the wider county as the woman who understood walls, and she was consulted on construction projects for years afterward by people who did not always understand the principles she explained, but trusted her results. In the spring of 1897, 12 years after she had built the first packed wood cavity, a young carpenter from a settlement near the Missouri Breaks rode 2 days to Tillman Creek to ask Clara to inspect a wall assembly he had built based on a description passed to him third hand. He was 23 years old and reminded Clara, she told her granddaughter later, of what Silas Redmond might have been at that age, serious and careful, and more interested in getting things right than in being told he already had. She walked him through the principles the same way she had walked Silas through them that April morning 11 years before starting with the ventilation channel, working outward, explaining not just the how but the why. Because a method without its reasoning is a recipe that stops working. The moment conditions change, and conditions on the frontier always changed. The young carpenter rode home and modified his design. And whether his version survived the following winter, the historical record does not say. But the knowledge traveled. It always traveled. The packed wood wall cavities were inspected and repacked twice during the cabin's 19-year life, once by Clara herself in the autumn of 1890, and once by the family that purchased the claim in 1903 after Clara relocated to Bismarck to be closer to her granddaughter, who had married a clerk at the Territorial Land Office and settled in a house with plaster walls and a coal furnace that held heat through the night, without any help from the walls at all. Clara visited that house for the first time in December of 1903 and stood in the parlor with her hand pressed flat against the interior wall, feeling for the warmth that should have been conducting through to the other side, and found almost none. The plaster was cool and still. The wall was doing nothing. It did not need to. The furnace ran all night, and the coal supply was delivered by wagon every 2 weeks, and the entire system worked by abundance rather than ingenuity, by having more fuel than the problem required, rather than by having a wall that stretched what fuel there was across twice the hours it should have covered. Clara stood there with her palm against the plaster and thought about a wall she had built 18 years earlier, with split cottonwood and dry grass. And she thought that the new way was better in every practical measure, and that something had been lost in it nonetheless. Some quality of attention, some respect for the problem, some willingness to sit with a difficulty long enough to find an answer in the materials already at hand, rather than simply purchasing a bigger answer from somewhere else. Both inspections of the original wall found the wood in sound condition, dry and structurally intact. The ventilation channel clear, the moisture management system functioning as designed. The wall that Silas Redmond predicted would rot in 2 seasons lasted 19 years without failure. The physics that Clara applied are not historical curiosities. Thermal mass slow heat release, moisture management, infiltration reduction. These are the foundation of every serious passive heating and building envelope strategy developed in the 20th and 21st centuries. Modern construction science has produced insulation materials and vapor barriers and thermal break assemblies that perform the same functions Clara achieved with split cottonwood and dry grass with considerably greater precision and reliability. But the underlying principle that a dense, slow-reacting mass within a wall assembly can store heat during active firing periods and release it during cold periods, reducing both temperature swings and fuel consumption, has not changed. It is the same principle that one woman on the northern Dakota plains worked out for herself in the fall of 1885 because she paid attention to things her neighbors had decided were not worth examining. The frontier was not short on intelligent people. It was not short on experienced builders or practical thinkers or men and women who understood cold and fire and wood in ways that most people living today never will. What it was sometimes short on was the willingness to question a system that everyone had agreed to treat as fixed. To look at a wall and ask, not how do I put more heat into the room, but how do I make the room hold the heat it already has? The first question leads to more wood, more hauling, more exhaustion, more of the same cycle that had trapped every settler in Tillman Creek since the first cabin was built. The second question leads to Clara's wall, to the cavity and the packed wood and the ventilation channel, and the 4,000 pounds of cottonwood that never burned, because burning was never the point. Clara Holbrook asked the second question. The winter of 1885 to 1886 answered it. Every frontier settlement had its unsolvable problems. The problems that were endured rather than solved, accepted rather than questioned, built around rather than built against. Most of those problems stayed unsolvable because the framing never changed, because the question stayed the same year after year and produced the same answer year after year. And nobody thought to ask a different question because the original question felt so obvious that alternatives seemed like foolishness. How do we stay warm? Burn more wood. The question and the answer locked together like two hands gripping each other, each one preventing the other from letting go. And the families inside that grip exhausting themselves season after season. Clara let go. She asked something else. And in a cabin on the southwest edge of a settlement that no modern map remembers, she built their answer into her walls and let the winter prove it, because she understood something about proof that her neighbors had not yet learned. The strongest argument is not the one you make with your voice. It is the one that is still standing in the morning when every other argument has gone cold. The frontier had a great many good ideas that the world forgot. The walls that held heat through the night when every other cabin went dark. The structures that worked with physics instead of against it. The women and men who looked at the materials around them and saw not what everyone else saw, but what everyone else had missed. Those ideas deserve to be remembered. Not because we are likely to need them in exactly the form Clara used them, though the principles remain valid and replicable, and are at this moment being rediscovered by builders who think they are inventing something new. They deserve to be remembered because the kind of thinking they represent is the kind that never stops being necessary. The willingness to look at what everyone else has accepted and ask whether acceptance is the same thing as truth. The patience to test an idea against a winter that does not care about reputations or opinions or the weight of 15 years of experience. The faith, not in luck but in arithmetic, that a wall packed with 4,000 pounds of dry wood will do exactly what the physics says it will do, regardless of who believes it and who does not. Clara Holbrook believed the physics. The winter confirmed it. The wall remembered.